Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
Welcome back, everyone, to GenX Classic Sports. Today is episode number 34. I'm your host, Sean Enos, and today we're going to dive into one of the most unique and underrated stars of the 1980s NFL, Roger Craig, the running back from the San Francisco 49ers. But first, trivia time. Today's topic lends itself to a really good trivia question. Here we go. Who are the only three players in NFL history to have 1,000 yards rushing and 1,000 yards receiving in the same season? Hit that pause button and think about it for a few seconds. Recently, this was done by Christian McCaffrey in 2019. Before him, this was done in 1999 by Marshall Faulk. And before both of them, the very first NFL player to rush for 1,000 yards and have 1,000 yards receiving in the same season was Roger Craig in 1985. And Roger is the subject of our conversation today. As much as it pains me to say it, I have to recognize the greatness of Roger Craig. And that's because if you grew up in the 80s and early 90s, you remember those great 49er teams. Joe Montana running the West Coast offense as their quarterback. Jerry Rice rewriting the history books from a small HBCU in Mississippi. He was the wide receiver, he was supposed to be too slow for the NFL. And Bill Walsh was the brains behind the whole operation as their head coach. But right in the middle of it all was this guy, Roger Craig. High knees pumping, catching passes out of the backfield. He redefined what a running back really could be in pro football, especially what they could be in today's modern game. You have to understand, the West Coast offense was the first offense that I can remember people talking about that required running backs to catch passes out of the backfield. That was a big deal. And he did that so well, and that's what made him a weapon in the 80s. And honestly, he's one of the first backs who really would fit into today's more spread option type of RPO type of offenses. And I think this guy would dominate today. I really do. So today, as I go through Roger Craig's story, maybe we should be asking ourselves, if you agree with me, why isn't this guy in the Hall of Fame? So let's start at the beginning. All right. Roger Craig played his college football at Nebraska back when the Cornhuskers were known for producing, really good, powerful, tough running teams. That's what they did. They ran the ball. But even in college, you could see with him that combination of sort of the toughness from Nebraska and the agility that normally you'd see in a wide receiver. And that's what would set him apart in the NFL. Because you know what? Nebraska wasn't really known for throwing passes. And we just talked about the 1983 draft in our last episode. And just think about the draft class from 1983 for a second. John Elway, Dan Marino, Jim Kelly, Eric Dickerson, complete legends of the game. We're talking Hall of Fame people here. And in that same draft, the 49ers took Craig in the second round because, 49th overall in the second round, because Bill Walsh, the head coach, he saw something in Craig that went, a little bit beyond being just a running back. He saw a guy who could really be a central part of this West Coast offense, someone who could run, who could block, and who could catch passes, an emphasis on that catch part. And Bill Walsh was right, like he was so many times. Craig started out sharing carries with a guy that's kind of been a little bit forgotten in history named Wendell Tyler, but it didn't take long before everyone knew that Roger Craig was the future for the 49ers. Now, if you're a Gen X fan, the first thing that probably comes to mind when you think about Roger Craig is that unique running style he had with the high knees pumping. Nobody else really ran like that. It looked almost like a drill, knees high kind of thing where you're running a ladder. Knees pumping, thighs up by his chest. Defenders typically bounced off of him due to that running style. And it looked flashy, but it really wasn't about style. That technique actually made him harder to tackle. You couldn't wrap the guy up easily because his legs were moving up and down like pistons the whole time, and he could push through arm tackles, like pretty easily. And if you combine that kind of running ability with soft hands, and I mean hands like a receiver, you had a running back who could hurt you in a lot of different ways. He was built perfectly for Walsh's short passing game, timing based West Coast offense. And Craig wasn't really just part of it. He was kind of the prototype for, maybe Walsh didn't even know it, but he was the prototype for what Walsh really needed to complete the West Coast offense. So let's talk about his career highlights. At the peak of his career, there's one season we really have to spotlight, and that was 1985. That year, now that means he was only in the league a couple of years. Roger Craig that year was the first player in NFL history to answer our trivia question to have over 1,000 yards rushing and over 1,000 yards receiving in the same season. And even though I was just a junior high kid, I remember them, the sports media, making a huge deal out of that. He had 1,050 yards rushing, 1,016 yards receiving. Nobody had ever done that before. In the 80s, running backs just didn't do that. They ran or they blocked. And Craig did both, and obviously he did it at an elite level. And, all these years later, we've seen guys like Marshall Faulk later on, LaDainian Tomlinson later on, and in the very recent past, and actually currently, we've seen Christian McCaffrey and Jahmyr Gibbs, those guys. But a lot of people forget, that Craig was the one who really opened that door. And really, one of the signs of greatness to me, and I think the Hall of Fame voters agree, one of the signs of greatness is how great players play in the postseason. And so there were the Super Bowls for Roger Craig, right? He played in 3 Super Bowls with the 49ers, all wins. He scored 3 touchdowns, 2 rushing, 1 receiving. In his biggest game, biggest Super Bowl, which was against Dan Marino and the Dolphins. So 3 touchdowns in a Super Bowl. In the 88 playoffs, he ran for 135 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Minnesota Vikings in the divisional round. And he just kind of proved that he could take over a game, because even with Montana and Rice on the field, for them to really be clicking, they had to have some running, and they had to have some, threat out of the backfield catching the ball. And that tells you how important he was to that dynasty. And let me tell you something. Another thing Hall of Fame people voters like, is consistency. And this guy was consistent. He put up multiple 1,000-yard rushing seasons, and he had several seasons with 70, 80 catches. That's a lot of receptions for a running back. This was the era before check down passes were really that much of a thing. I mean, he was part of the planned passing attack coming out of the backfield. He wasn't just where you flip the ball to for Montana to avoid a sack. These were planned plays, and he made those kinds of plays deadly. Most teams kind of take for granted the banana route side of the backfield and things like that, and that was part of what they did on purpose. It's that balance that he exhibited as an individual, but it's that balance that the offense had, the threat of running and passing, that made the 49ers back in the 80s, which they were the team of the 80s with 4 Super Bowls. That's the kind of threat on offense that you just can't stop. It feels like every team does that now, right? But back then, that wasn't a thing. Strategy-wise, this is what's really cool to me. This was an era when linebackers were built really to stop the run, because balance back then meant you threw the ball a lot. If you don't believe me, just go look at the career numbers of some of the Hall of Fame passers from the 70s and 80s. Balance meant, we're throwing it just as much as we're running. It wasn't a top-heavy passing system back then that anyone had. So teams were built to stop the run primarily. So imagine a guy like Craig comes along, and before him, you've had these big linebackers, these big guys like Lawrence Taylor that were built to plug the holes and stop the run and chase guys out on the edge, stop those sweeps from happening and so forth. Big guys who could stop the run. Now Craig comes along, and suddenly those linebackers that teams had traditionally tried to seek and draft for a couple of decades, suddenly those guys are too big and too slow to cover him out of the backfield, okay? So now teams in that division, they're having to look for this new kind of linebacker, one with speed and cover skills, because those were way more important suddenly. So especially teams in the division, because you got to play this guy twice. And so his threat at being a receiver out of the backfield, it changed the game on both sides of the ball, because it changed the way defenses and teams started scouting for their linebackers. As far as the fans were concerned, Roger Craig, he wasn't flashy, kind of like a Marcus Allen type. He wasn't really that. And he wasn't really a power back like the Earl Campbells of the day. He was something different, He was a hybrid kind of guy, versatile. Versatility, it's not exactly what I would consider something that was sexy in the 1980s. It was effective, and it made the 49ers unstoppable, but they were kind of, I think now you would call them exotic compared to everybody around them, meaning, a completely kind of different take on offense. And, really, if you'll go back and watch any film on YouTube from the 80s and the 70s, it's shocking, even into the early 90s, it's shocking how many times teams ran plays with a fullback and two tight ends on the field, therefore only two wide receivers. It's shocking. It just doesn't even look right to have multiple backs in the backfield on some of the footage that you see. So, trotting out that kind of formation, if you don't have a third receiver and a slot receiver type guy on the field, who's going to catch the passes? And so I guess to his credit, Bill Walsh had a plan that his running backs would catch them, and they'd catch them coming out of the backfield. And so that strategy obviously paid off with 4 Super Bowls, and it took teams a while to adapt to that. And a big part of that was, Roger Craig and his unique versatility. And think about the fact that, yes, as we've had on another episode, history-wise, there was fantasy football back then in its primitive stages. But he was a fantasy football star before most of the country was playing fantasy football. Yeah, before it was even really a thing. You could count on him for rushing yards, for receiving yards, for touchdowns, for the number of receptions. This guy would dominate today in fantasy football. And, the thing about him that's sad in a way is that he was overshadowed because of who he played with. He played with Montana and he played with Rice, and a defense that had its share of marquee names like Ronnie Lott. And, Montana and Rice are two of the greatest to ever do it. And so Craig kind of played in those shadows. And the fans, especially the 49ers fans, they know how valuable he was. And I think opponents, reluctantly admit on here often that I'm a Cowboys fan, and I know how versatile he was and how important he was and how valuable he was and how outstanding he was, because, my team, along with a lot of other teams, couldn't stop him. So there's that. And as I read somewhere, he wasn't a piece of the puzzle. He's one of the reasons the puzzle came together in the first place. So I do think that's pretty high praise for the guy. So he's with the 49ers several years into his career. They've won 3 Super Bowls with him. Like I said, they won 4 overall, 3 with him. And so around 1990, after he'd been there 7 years or so, it was time to move on. So he spent a year with the Raiders and then a couple of seasons with the Vikings. And he was productive, but not at the level that he was as a younger man, obviously. He was never quite the same outside of the West Coast offense that Bill Walsh ran. And that's a shame because, like I said, the Niners were running a unique offense, and I think that other teams probably just didn't know how to utilize the guy. So by the time he retired his numbers, they were pretty impressive. He had more than 8,000 yards rushing and 5,000 yards, close to 5,000 yards receiving, and 73 touchdowns, which is a lot of touchdowns. Now, keep in mind when I say all of this about him, this is 1990. He's 7 years into his career. You know, running backs, there's been a study done on this by different NFL entities. And running backs, statistically speaking, running backs are done after 28 years old. And by done, I mean they're just not as effective. Their yardage, their durability, everything drops off dramatically after 28 years old. So he's been in the league 7 years. He's around 28-ish, 29-ish when he leaves the 49ers. And so he, you know, statistically it makes sense. But he could still provide 1,000 yards a season for you. It just may not be 1,000 of each. He was still deadly as far as he could rush for close to that and have receptions for close to that. And so he was still effective in his last few stops before retirement. Nowadays, it's not as big of a deal. It's really not. It's actually kind of a joke, the Pro Bowl. But going back, the Pro Bowl was a big deal. The Pro Bowl was a big deal for one reason, because back in the day, meaning the 80s and before, players didn't make the kind of money they make now, nowhere even close. And so the Pro Bowl and the playoffs actually provided them extra game checks. They got paid to go to playoff games, and they got paid to win those playoff games, and then they got paid to go to the Pro Bowl, and I think they got paid to win it. So as silly as it may sound nowadays, knowing how much money these guys make, it was a big deal recognition-wise, but it was also, and it was also an incentive monetarily to go to the Pro Bowl, meaning play great all season. So he made 4 of the Pro Bowls, which back then was a big deal. And in 1988, he was the NFL Offensive Player of the Year, and that's a big reward. You have the MVP, you have the Offensive Player of the Year, and the Defensive Player of the Year. So that was a big one. And, for the 80s, for him to be active in the 80s, he kind of set a standard back then that we sort of just expect now for running backs. Not necessarily the same exact numbers, but, being a fantasy footballer, I know that I'm looking for guys that can catch passes, and because you score more points. And there are a lot of running backs in the NFL compared to back then, a lot more of them who can catch passes effectively out of the backfield. And so here's the question, all right? Why isn't Roger Craig in the Hall of Fame? And, to this day, he's probably one of the biggest omissions, in my opinion, because Marcus Allen is in, Thurman Thomas is in, Emmitt Smith's in. Those guys they overlapped his career. But you can argue that Craig changed the position more than anybody did. And if the Hall of Fame is really about impact and innovation and being good in the postseason and all that, then Roger Craig, he checks all 3 of those boxes. And remember, this is a Cowboys fan saying that. That's how much respect I have for this guy. So let's put it another way, okay? I hate this question, so that's why I'm going to give it to everybody else, because it really irritates me. Mount Rushmore, that means you've got 4 heads on the statue, right? Or on the monument, whatever you want to call it. So let's put this a little bit in perspective. If the 49ers have a Mount Rushmore, 4 guys, that's all you get, of offensive players, maybe of any players, who do you put in it? Most people, I think, have no problem saying Montana's in there, right? And Jerry Rice is in there. All right, so those are 2 automatics. You got 2 spots left. If you're talking offense only, is Steve Young on there? He won a Super Bowl. Maybe, right? Took over from Montana. Frank Gore, who is, I don't know, 2nd or 3rd on the all-time rushing list now, something like that. He played a really long time in the NFL. Is he on there? Is our guy Roger Craig on there? Does he belong? I think he does. Given the impact that he had in 2 different parts of the game, passing and receiving, and the fact that he didn't have any peers back in that era as far as that goes, I think he's on there. But, you only get 4 guys, so I don't know. Montana and Rice, those are 2. It's a given. They're on there. You probably are going to have to argue over Ronnie Lott and guys like that being on it with those first two. And here's another thing to think about. What would Roger Craig look like in today's NFL? With the rules we have now where you can't touch the quarterback, you can't touch wide receivers, everything favors the passing game and everything favors scoring points. And with the creative minds that we have now, quite frankly, some of the younger guys that are coming up through the college ranks with these creative schemes for offense, and the fact that quarterbacks, they check down so often to running backs now, I would think this guy would score absolutely crazy numbers in fantasy football. I mean, maybe 100 receptions a year would be pretty normal. He was ahead of his time. And, sometimes with guys in sports, that's the problem. They're a little bit too far ahead of their time, and that means people don't appreciate what they did until they kind of put some study into it later on when others have sort of approached those kinds of achievements. But, hey, Gen X fans, we remember. We do. We remember those high knees and the way he pumped his legs and the touchdowns in the Super Bowl and the way he made football look in a way that had never been done before. We remember. So as we wrap this one up, let's give Roger Craig his due. Tough for me to say that, but the guy was that good. He wasn't just another guy in the 49ers dynasty. He was a true trailblazer. The first 1,000/1,000 back Super Bowl hero, 4-time Pro Bowler, and the guy who changed the way running backs are used forever. So the Hall of Fame voters, they may not recognize it yet. Gen X fans, I think we do, that we know that Roger Craig, he deserves to be in Canton. So that's the story of Roger Craig, one of the guys who really shaped my view of the football world during my Gen X formative years. And he was quite the player. If you find some footage online, I think you'll appreciate him. Thanks for joining me on this episode. Please remember, give us a thumbs up or a like and subscribe to our show. All those things are huge for us. They help us on the journey here. And, I've seen some jumps in our numbers lately, and that's very exciting. We want to keep the momentum rolling. As always, thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to me and all of my buddies talk about the things that we love to talk about. So until next time, let's keep celebrating those Gen X legends, and we'll talk to you in a week.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.